he dared to change the wine of the Last Supper. What if I told you one of Christianity's oldest and most sacred traditions was changed forever? By a dentist who was terrified of seeing drunkards in church. It sounds like the setup to a bad joke, but it's the absolute truth. His invention, born from a personal crisis of faith, was seen by many as a direct attack on a ritual established by Jesus himself. It was a product that, by all accounts, should have failed. And for a while, it did. This is the wild story of how one man as flopped rode a massive wave of social change to redefine the taste of communion for millions around the globe. For nearly 2,000 years, the act of Holy Communion was anchored by two constant, unshakable elements: bread and wine. It was a practice that stretched all the way back to a dusty upper room in Jerusalem, to the final, somber meal Jesus shared with his disciples. But in the 19th century, one man looked at the sacred cup and didn't just see the symbolic blood of Christ. He saw a threat. He saw the cup of devils, and he decided he was going to be the one to change it. This decision would pit him against the full force of Christian tradition, sparking accusations of heresy. But it would also set in motion a chain of events that put a product, born from a failed side business, onto the altars of churches worldwide, and into the pantries of millions. To really get how radical this idea was, you have to understand the profound, almost mystical significance of wine in the Christian faith. This wasn't just a beverage choice. It was a cornerstone of worship, steeped into millennia of theology and tradition. The story begins, of course, at the Last Supper. In the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the scene is painted with solemn reverence. Jesus takes bread, blesses it, and gives it to his disciples, saying, "This is my body." Then he takes a cup. He gives thanks and passes it to them, saying words that would echo through the centuries. "Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." In Luke's Gospel, he calls the contents the fruit of the vine. For the next 1800 years, the Christian church, in all its shapes and forms, took this command with the utmost seriousness. Theologians would argue over what exactly was happening, whether the wine literally became the blood of Christ, a process called transubstantiation, as the Catholic Church taught, or if it was a powerful spiritual symbol, but the physical element itself was never in question. It was wine. It was fermented. It was the fruit of the vine as it had been known for thousands of years. Picture a typical church service in the 18th or early 19th century. Whether in a grand cathedral in Europe or a simple wooden chapel on the American frontier, the climax of the service was Holy Communion. The minister would recite the words of Jesus at that final meal. The bread would be passed, and then the cup, often a single, shared chalice, would be passed among the faithful. The liquid inside was wine. Its sharp, distinct aroma was inseparable from the sacredness of the moment. To suggest changing this wasn't like suggesting a new hymn. It was to tamper with the very words of Jesus. It questioned a practice that bound a global faith across continents and centuries. For most of Christian history, asking, "What should we drink for communion?" would have sounded nonsensical. The answer was obvious. It was wine. Period. The thought that it could be anything else was, to put it mildly, unthinkable. It was a direct, sensory connection to the Last Supper. And to challenge that, you'd need a really, really good reason. That reason was about to arrive. Not in a theological debate, but in the social chaos of a nation that was drinking itself to death. The 19th century United States was a nation awash in alcohol. To us, the sheer amount they drank is staggering. It was a culture soaked in spirit, from the morning eye-opener to the nightly put-to-bed. Alcohol was cheaper than tea or coffee and often safer to drink than unpurified water. Saloons were everywhere, acting as community centers, political hubs, and places of business. For many working men, the whiskey break was as common as a coffee break is today. Historians estimate that in the 1830s, the average American adult drank the equivalent of over 7 gallons of pure alcohol per year, nearly triple what people drink today. This wasn't just social drinking. It was a public health crisis on an epic scale. The consequences were devastating and visible all around. Poverty, domestic violence, crime, and public disorder were rampant, and so much of it could be traced directly back to the bottle. It was against this backdrop that one of America's most powerful social movements was born. The temperance movement. It started out surprisingly moderate. In 1785, Dr. Benjamin Rush, a respected physician and a signer of the Declaration of Independence, published a pamphlet detailing the destructive effects of distilled spirits like whiskey, pushing for moderation. But that little spark was fanned into a bonfire by the religious fervor of the Second Great Awakening. This wave of Protestant revivalism infused the temperance cause with a new, uncompromising morality. Suddenly, alcohol wasn't just a social problem, it was a sin. The goal was no longer moderation, it was total abstinence, or the language became militant. Preachers no longer spoke of the dangers of spirits, they spoke of demon rum and the cup of devils. Alcohol was evil, a tool of Satan to destroy families and corrupt a Christian nation. The Methodist Church was at the forefront of this new, radical form of temperance. They were soon joined by powerful new organizations, most notably the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, founded in 1874. These women, seeing the destructive impact of alcoholism on their homes, became an unstoppable force. They organized, marched, and lobbied relentlessly for prohibition. Figures like Carrie Nation became infamous, a hatchet-wielding crusader who would stride into saloons and physically smash barrels of liquor, believing she was doing God's work. And all this created a profound, glaring hypocrisy right at the heart of the church. How could a minister preach a fire and brimstone sermon against demon rum, demanding total abstinence, and then, moments later, offer those same people a cup of alcoholic wine at the Lord's Supper? It was a theological and practical crisis. Stories began to spread of reformed alcoholics who would take the communion cup, taste the wine, and find their old cravings reignited, sending them spiraling back into addiction. The very sacrament meant to offer grace was becoming a stumbling block. Churches, especially Methodist churches, were in a bind. They were leading a national crusade against alcohol, yet they were mandated by 2,000 years of tradition to serve it. The demand for a solution grew louder. They needed a pure, unfermented fruit of the vine. And the man who would provide it wasn't a theologian or a bishop, but a multitasking dentist from New Jersey. Thomas Bramwell Welch was a man of many talents. Born in England in 1825, he moved to America as a child and became a man of intense conviction. He was an ordained Wesleyan Methodist minister, a physician, and, most famously, a dentist. But threaded through all of this was one unwavering passion: his devotion to the cause of temperance. In 1865, Welch moved to Vineland, New Jersey, a planned community founded on temperance principles. It was a town without saloons, a perfect home for someone with his anti-alcohol views. There, he became a communion steward at the local Methodist Episcopal Church. This role forced him to confront the church's great hypocrisy head-on. He was so opposed to alcohol that he reportedly did not even want to touch the wine bottles he was responsible for serving. This wasn't just an intellectual puzzle for Welch. It was a crisis of conscience. He knew Jesus had used wine, but he also saw the real-world devastation caused by alcoholism every day and believed it was an evil that had to be eradicated. He simply could not reconcile these two truths. He wasn't the first to struggle with this. The demand for unfermented communion wine had been growing. In fact, some Methodist denominations had been calling for it for decades. The Methodist Episcopal Church had officially recommended using the pure juice of the grape in 1864, 5 years before Welch's invention. But this was easier said than done. The problem was basic chemistry. Before modern refrigeration, keeping grape juice from turning into wine was almost impossible. Yeast on the grape skins naturally consumes the sugars, producing alcohol. To stop it, you had to get rid of the yeast. Churches tried boiling the juice, which killed the yeast, but also left a cooked, syrupy mess that nobody wanted to drink. There was no consistent, reliable way to produce a pure grape juice. What the temperance movement needed was a technological breakthrough, and Thomas Welch, with his scientific mind, started to wonder. He'd been following the work of a French scientist named Louis Pasteur, and he had an idea for how one of Pasteur's famous techniques could solve the church's sacred dilemma. The solution came to Thomas Welch in 1869, not in some fancy lab, but but in his own kitchen. The scientific key, of course, was pasteurization. Welch had read about Louis Pasteur's process of heating liquids, just enough to kill the microorganisms like yeast that cause fermentation without ruining the taste. If the liquid was then sealed in an airtight container, it would stay preserved. This was the breakthrough he needed. For his raw material, Welch was in luck. He lived in a region where the Concord grape, a new, robust, and flavorful variety, was thriving. He had them growing right in his own yard. And so, with his wife Lucy's help, Welch picked the ripe Concord grapes, squeezed the juice, and then came the crucial step. He gently heated the deep purple liquid in kettles, carefully controlling the temperature. Immediately after heating, he poured the hot juice into bottles, filling them to the brim to leave no room for oxygen, and sealed them tight with cork and wax. Had done Italiano. He had created a shell-stable, unfermented grape juice. He had captured the fruit of the vine in a bottle, stopping time before nature could turn it to alcohol. But what to call it? He didn't call it grape juice. His chosen name was incredibly strategic. Dr. Welch's unfermented wine. This was brilliant branding. He was positioning it not as a new drink, but as a direct, biblically acceptable substitute. It was still wine, just in a pure form that, he argued, was more fitting for a holy sacrament. Thomas Welch now held the answer in his hands. He was ready to solve the church's great communion dilemma. He was about to find out that changing a 2,000-year-old tradition was a lot harder than boiling juice on a stove. Armed with his bottles of unfermented wine, Thomas Welch approached local churches, expecting a hero's welcome. Instead, he was met with skepticism and outright rejection. The product born of a passion to serve the church was a product the church, it seemed, didn't want. Why? First and foremost, the sheer weight of history. For almost 2,000 years, the cup had contained fermented wine. That's what Jesus used. Critics accused Welch, a dentist, of trying to rewrite scripture to suit a modern social movement. The central command of communion was this: do in remembrance of me. For many, that meant doing it exactly as Jesus did. To change the element from wine to juice was seen as a dangerous innovation. Then there was simple human resistance to change. Church is built on ritual. The communion service was a solemn familiar rite. Welch's juice, well, it was different. It tasted sweeter, fruitier. It felt, to many, like a child's drink. For denominations less caught up in the temperance craze like Lutherans, Presbyterians, and certainly Roman Catholics, whole idea was a non-starter. Welch did manage one small victory. He convinced his own church in Vineland to use his juice, but that's as far as it went. He tried to turn his invention into a small side business, but the orders just didn't come in. After 4 years of trying and failing, Thomas Welch gave up. The business was a flop. He was a busy man with a successful dental practice, and the unfermented wine project was a waste of time and money. He abandoned it. His invention seemed destined to be a historical footnote. Thomas Welch would never, personally, make a penny from his idea. The kettles cooled, and the sacred tradition of communion wine seemed secure. So how did Welch's invention go from a failed product to a communion staple? How did it leap from a dusty shelf in a dentist's workshop to the center of the altar? For that, we need to meet the second generation. A son with a vision his father lacked. But first, if you're finding this story as fascinating as I do, consider subscribing for more hidden histories like this one. The story of Welch's grape juice should have ended there, but it was resurrected by his son, Charles E. Welch. Like his father, Charles was a dentist, but unlike his father, he had a killer marketing instinct and saw a golden opportunity where his father had only seen failure. Around 1875, Charles convinced his father to restart production. He knew the world had changed. The temperance movement was now a political and social juggernaut. The soil was far more fertile for an alcohol-free communion wine. Charles E. developed a brilliant marketing strategy. First, he learned from his father's mistake and targeted his efforts with laser precision. He went straight to the heart of the movement, the Methodist Church, distributing free samples to congregations and ministers. Second, he masterfully controlled the branding. He eventually changed the name to the simpler, more direct Welch's grape juice. He took out ads in countless religious and medical publications, promoting it not just as a substitute, but as a pure, healthful, and even more biblically authentic option. He claimed it was the kind of wine used in Galilee, a clever, if historically shaky claim. Third, he worked to make the product official. He lobbied Methodist conferences, building on their pro-temperance stance. By the 1890s, ads for Welch's were appearing in official Methodist journals. Welch's had effectively become the official drink of Methodist communion. It was a stunning reversal of fortune. But the real turning point came in 1893 at the Chicago World's Fair. This massive event showcased American innovation, and Charles Welch was there, handing out countless samples. For the first time, a huge, secular audience was exposed to the product. It was here that Welch's began to shift from a sacramental product to a popular health beverage. Soda fountains started serving it, and doctors began recommending it. The business exploded. The failed side project of the father became a vast fortune for the son. Charles Welch became a millionaire, yet he never lost sight of the product's religious roots. In his will, he wrote that unfermented grape juice was born in 1869 out of a passion to serve God by helping his church to give its communion the fruit of the vine, instead of the cup of devils. The son had not only realized his father's vision, he had surpassed it in ways Thomas could never have dreamed. The early 20th century saw the ultimate triumph of grape juice. The final victory came with the ratification of the 18th Amendment in 1919, which kicked off the era of national prohibition. While the Volstead Act, the law enforcing prohibition, did include an exemption for the sacramental use of wine for a huge part of Protestant America, the matter was settled. Decades of temperance preaching had done their job. For many churches, using alcoholic wine was now unthinkable. Legal or not, it was a spiritual compromise with demon rum. Welch's grape juice was no longer just an alternative. It was the only morally acceptable choice. Prohibition cemented its place on the altar, and the influence didn't stop at America's borders. As Protestant missionaries traveled the globe, they took their teetotaling convictions with them, introducing communion, not with traditional wine, but with the unfermented grape juice they knew from back home. A kitchen invention from New Jersey began to change the practice of communion around the world. Back home, the Welch's company continued to boom. Having conquered the church market, it expanded. In 1918, it introduced a grape jam called grape, which became a staple for soldiers in World War I. This was followed by Welch's grape jelly in 1923, which would eventually become one half of America's most iconic sandwich. The PB&J, the company that started as a religious side project, was now an American food giant. There is a deep irony here. National prohibition is now widely seen as a colossal failure. It fueled organized crime and was so unpopular it was repealed in 1933. The movement failed to permanently change America's drinking habits, but it had one single, lasting success. It permanently changed how millions of Christians celebrate their most sacred ritual. The one place where the temperance movement truly won was inside the church. So, did a dentist who was afraid of drunkards in church really change one of Christianity's oldest traditions? The answer is a resounding yes. The story of Welch's grape juice is a perfect storm of history. It began with a 2,000-year-old tradition that collided with a powerful social crisis. At 19 Thursday century America, ravaged by alcoholism. This created a theological dilemma that a devout and inventive dentist, Thomas Welch, tried to solve. His solution was initially rejected, a commercial failure. But then, his son Charles resurrected the idea. With savvy marketing and perfect timing, he rode the crest of the temperance wave, turning his father's failed product into a massive success. Prohibition was its final victory, cementing its place on the altar for generations. Today, Welch's is a household name, known more for jelly and juice boxers than for its revolutionary role in church history. Since 1956, the company has been a cooperative, owned by the grape farmers who grow its iconic Concord grapes. And every Sunday, in countless churches across the globe, millions of Christians partake in the Lord's Supper, drinking small cups of grape juice. Most have no idea that the liquid they're drinking exists because of a devout dentist, his marketing genius son, and the long-gone crusade against demon rum. It's a powerful reminder that history is rarely a straight line. It's a chaotic dance between personal conviction, scientific innovation, and the irresistible tides of social change. The next time you see that familiar purple label in the grocery store, remember the unlikely journey of what's inside the bottle. A story of failure and success, tradition and revolution, and how a simple desire to keep the church sober ended up redefining a sacred tradition for millions.